In this tutorial, we'll be looking at the small blind versus big blind 3-bet pot formation. So between the small blind and the big blind, there will be a variety of different 3-bet pot formations that you can actually arrive to. So we'll be looking at the pre-flop strategy between the small blind and the big blind. And then we'll take a look at one particular subformation and look at the post-flop strategies across a variety of different flops, particularly looking at certain board textures and seeing how each player will play those types of flops. So first off, let's take a look at the pre-flop strategy. So here we've got a 100 big blind 6 max simulation with bunching, and we've got a 5% rake with a 1 big blind cap. So this is somewhere between 200 and 500 now in terms of the rake. So folds around to the small blind, and we'll take a look at the opening strategy for the small blind and then the 3-bet strategy for the big blind. So in the previous videos, we've looked at some of the opening strategies for the small blind, and now we'll look at how the small blind will respond to 3-bet. So let's say the 2.5 open size, and the big blind has a variety of 3-bet sizes that they can choose from. Against a 2.5, they're centering around the 7.5 to 8.5 big blind to 3-bet, maybe down to 7 at some stage, maybe up to 9 big blinds at some stage. So let's have a look at this 8 big blind to 3-bet, so 110% pot 3-bet here. And now this is the small blind's response. If you notice, the small blind is calling with essentially a lot of their pocket pairs up to 9s, the suited Broadway hands, strong offsuit Broadways, all the suited aces, and down to king 8 suited. Some of the suited connectors are calling as well, and some of the suited 9s. And this is a fairly large 3-bet relative to the opening size. Once we know the 3-bet calling range, we should also take a look at the 4-bet range as well. The small blind is going to be 4-betting basically 10s plus and ace king and ace queen for the value component, and there's going to be plenty of bluffing candidates and semi-bluffing candidates, namely these suited aces, some of the sort of Broadway hands, and hands like king jack offsuit. It's definitely a bluff. If you look at its EV, it's with the king jack offsuit essentially 0, even folding 0.5% of the time. So the EV of this king jack offsuit, even though it's played 99% of the time, its EV is basically 0. And similarly, ace 10 offsuit, fairly low EV, being used as a 4-bet bluff there as well. Now, if we can compare this open size and the 3-bet size to a slightly different 3-bet size, let's say we go smaller, so instead of 8, we go down to 7. So it's only a 20% difference in the actual raise size from 110 down to 90, but we can see that there's far more calls in the small blinds range, particularly with these suited gappers. All the suited connectors are starting to call now, a little bit more suited kings and slightly more offsuit hands, offsuit Broadway type hands. If your opponent does 3-bet you for a small size, don't be afraid to call some of these. You will need to call some of those to defend some of the time. And conversely, if your opponent 3-bets you to a bigger size, instead of the 8, we'll look at the 9 big blinds, so 2.5 up to 9, so fairly big 3-bet up to 130%. Now, the small blind is starting to fold basically all of their suited connectors, rarely calling them some of the time, starting to fold pocket 2s through pocket 4s, the S2 suited is letting it go, and now the king jack and ace 10 offsuit starting to fold a lot more. So that was a 2.5 open. You can look at the similarities with the 3 big blind open and the same sorts of sizes. So 3 big blind up to 9 big blind. This is fairly similar to the 2.5 up to 8, maybe a little bit tighter with the folding of the pocket 2s, slightly more folding of the suited and connected type hands. But you notice that the 4-bet range is very similar. And the reason behind this is essentially that the 4-bet range is going to be similar in sort of its character across the similar 3-bet sizes that the big blind can use. For example, you go slightly bigger here, the 4-bet range is roughly the same types of hands. So if you know what hands you want to be 4-betting for value with, this is a 10s plus and ace king suited, ace king and ace queen suited. There's a little bit of ace queen offsuit as the value component, and then you bluffs like this jack 9, king jack, ace 10 offsuit, these sort of aces. Once you know that, it's fairly easy to construct your 4-bet range, regardless of what 3-bet size your opponent chooses. So that was 10.2. Even if they go really big up to say 4x up to 12 here, your 4-bet range will be fairly similar. So 10s plus ace king and ace queen suited is a value component, and then you choose some bluffs from the remainder of the range. So here these ace 5 suited, those offsuit Broadway type hands going for the bluff. And then the other thing to notice is the 4-bet size itself. So 3 big blind open, big blind here will 3-bet to 9 big blinds, and the small blind has a variety of different 4-bet sizes that you can choose from. So here, if you look, the main 4-bet sizes that the small blind picks is around this 50 to 60% of the pot, so it's 18 to 20-ish big blinds. But then there's also an additional set of hands up the top here where they go for sort of 25, 26, 27 big blinds, and that's this very big 4-bet size is centered around this ace-king offsuit, which plays quite differently to ace-king suited. And in this particular formation, ace-king offsuit benefits significantly by going fairly big with the 4-bet size. So let's say pot-sized 4-bet, getting called by a lot of hands that are dominated. So this ace-queen suited, ace-10 suited, king-queen suited, king-10 suited. All these hands are very much dominated by the ace-king, and then essentially coin flips against the rest of it. And if you get jammed on, you put enough money in that you can essentially just snap call, and your EV there is a little bit on the negative side, but obviously far more than folding, given that you put so much in. The flip side is if your opponent goes for the call, then your EV with ace-king is pretty huge. So this decision to 4-bet is about 5 big blinds in EV compared to -3, which is folding, or 2, which is calling. Big differences, so make sure you 4-bet ace-king offsuit. And 4-betting to a bigger size is what's preferred with that particular hand. If you notice here, ace-king offsuit 4-betting really small is pretty horrendous, and 4-betting a little bit too big, and even jamming here is a little bit too much at this early stage in the game tree. Now, if we compare that to something a little bit bigger, say for example, the small blind opens to 3.5, and then that these 3-bet sizes that the big blind uses are fairly similar to previous ones. Once again, against the small open sizes, we were looking between sort of 7 and 8 big blinds. That medium open size is between 8 and 9, and now this slightly bigger open size to 3.5. The big blind is 3-betting up to between 9 and say 10, with a decent variety of different 3-bet sizes. And once again, you can notice some subtle differences between the ace-king offsuit and the ace-king suited, ace-queen offsuit, ace-queen suited. There is a preference for ace-king offsuit to go for a bigger 3-bet. So if you look at here, the colors that the ace-king offsuit uses in terms of the sizes, here you've got this 10.5 size, this 9.8 size, and this 9 big blind size being taken fairly often. Compare that to ace-king suited, and then suddenly you've got sort of 8.4, 9.1 being taken more often. So slightly bigger sizes are being used by ace-king compared to ace-king, ace-king offsuit compared to ace-king suited, and similarly ace-queen offsuit compared to ace-queen suited. It's a subtle thing, but a lot of the slightly bigger sizes will deviate towards ace-king offsuit. Benefits tremendously by just getting in more money into the pot pre-flop and playing against those dominated aces and kings in the calling range. And then once again, you've got the split between the ace-king suited and ace-king offsuit in the 4-bet size. So here, ace-king offsuit is essentially 4-betting fairly big to the 27 to 30 big blind range, sometimes splitting into the small 4-bet size, but mostly here the ace-king suited is going for the small 4-bet up to 21. Basically just a 50% click back, 23, a little bit more than 50% as well, and then even just a click back to 18.9. All right, so today we'll be looking at the post-flop situations after we go 3 big blind and then 9 big blind and a call. The simulations that I've got here for post-flop using the non-bunching simulations, pre-flop sim. So the ranges will be slightly different, but not by a huge amount. So let's dive right into it. We can take a first look at this 4-span low. So some of these are 18 low flops. If we look at the ranges quickly, the ranges in position, this is the 3-bet range. Out of position, this is the calling range. You can see these broadways, pocket pairs, some of the suited connectors, all going for the call. We look at the database itself, 4-span low, and the small blind essentially not doing any donking on these types of boards. Small blind goes for the check, and then the big blind has a choice between sort of these different sizes, 25, 35, 50, 75, and the big blind here is essentially only really going for this 35 and 50% depending on the different boards. If the board is particularly dry, in terms of not really having a flush draw, it'll tend to size up a little bit, 50%. And then if the board is a little bit wet with the flush draw, it will size down. Why is that? It's pretty straightforward. If you look at the preflop ranges between each player, we look at the flush draw boards. The small blind here has a significant amount of flush draws in the range, so 16%, 16.7% flush draws in small blind's range, compared to the big blind, which only has 8.19% flush draws there. Reason being is small blind simply calls more suited combos pre-flop than the big blind 3-bets, and so on two-tone boards, the small blind will have a flush draw advantage, and flush draws are incredibly strong, usually having north of 50% equity against most betting ranges, and will pretty happily get all the money in on the flop if needed, especially for this low stack to pot ratio. So say, for example, check 35%. If you bet a little bit too big, say, for example, half pot, you start getting ripped on by some of these flush draws. Bet a little bit bigger than that, and these flush draws can just jam into you, and these flush draws are doing really well. So bet a little bit on the smaller side. Avoid running into sort of a set top pair, pocket pair, and a flush draw. And if you compare that to the offsuit version of this board, because there aren't any flush draws really. There's backdoor flush draws, but there aren't any flush draws. The big blind can size up, knowing that the small blind now has to call with many weaker made hands, such as the ace high and pocket pairs and suited king highs, right? Rather than just calling with a strong draw, such as the flush draw. All the flush draws will continue. So that being said, when there is a two-tone board, the big blind will be betting slightly smaller compared to the rainbow board of the same type. Take another look at that. 10-5-2. Small blind will be checking everything. Big blind betting around half pot. Big blind obviously betting basically all the over pairs, strong top pairs. For value, ace high and king high, etc. hands will be used as the bluffs. But if we compare that to 10-5-2 with the flush draw on the board, the two-tone board, small one once again checks everything, and now here you still got a half pot bet out of the big blind. Why is there a half pot bet here compared to on the 7 high board? It's mainly because now the small blind with the 10 on the board itself, that 10 blocks a significant number of the flush draws out of the small blind's range. So blocks a good chunk of these, going from that 16% down to this 10%. So 17 down to 10, a 6% difference in the flush draw density. And that allows the big blind to bet slightly bigger, because once again, there's not quite enough flush draws to defend against the half pot bet on the flop. And so the small blind now needs to defend some weak pairs. And now if you contrast that to, say, for example, these two. Now, if you notice the difference between that 10 high board, let's have a look at this 10-7-2 actually, that 10 high board and this 10 high board, right? The difference here is that the 10 of the flush draw is not on the board. Here's the 7 and the 2. And so that 10 of the flush draw is not blocking these suited hands in the small blind's range. So now the small blind has a significantly more flush draws than previously. So now we're at 15%. And that extra 5% difference in the flush draw density is enough to twist the big blind to want to bet smaller. Another reason is that you can think about these particular hands as ace 10, king 10, queen 10, jack 10, 10, 9 suited. These hands are very strong on the flop in terms of the one pair plus the flush draw, meaning that in reality, if you look at a hand like 10-9 suited against a hand like pocket jacks, it's basically a coin flip, right? So these 10-9 suited can go for a raise, etc. Pocket jacks rips it in, and now 10-9 suited here has got 54% equity against the jamming range. And the jamming range is made up essentially of like pocket jacks and some small density of like random pairs, right? Random pairs, random draws, random flush draws. The hand itself is very strong. The 10-9 suited, jack 10 suited, queen 10 suited, king 10 suited, ace 10 suited of spades, right? And so that difference, those extra combos of those particular hands, means that the big blind doesn't want to bet too big. They bet too big, those particular hands, those top pair with the flush draw, are going to raise. Going to raise, Obviously, you're still going to be getting it in with hands like pocket jacks, but then hands that are weaker than pocket jacks, or the middle of the range, the weaker top pairs, pocket pairs such as nines, etc., don't have that luxury of going for a bet on the flop and then checking back the turn and seeing the river. In contrast to the 10-7-2 without the flush draw, we will be betting a little bit bigger and then checking down with a hand like nines or eights, which you can't do as effectively on the flush draw board because you get raised. Check, half pot, sure there's still some raising, call, check, pocket nines, checks back, still top pair goes for the bet. Let's get rid of the 2, let's go for a 4. Top pair still goes for a bet, weaker top pairs check back, and now check, say overcard, queen, check, and now the 10x and pocket nines, etc. will just check back. So that doesn't happen quite as often on the flush draw board here because of the slightly higher check raise frequency, 16%, smaller bet, 16%. And then, say for example, you do go for the bet, the 4 comes, pocket nines will still check back, but now your opponent's hands have more equity against you, those 10x. Those flush draws without the 10, those flush draws just in general are going to draw against you at a higher frequency, and then so you get bet into, and pocket nines is not exactly loving it. If you face a bigger bet, pocket nines is indifferent. You check, you snap check back with the pocket nines there. All right, so let's move on. We've been talking about these 4-span lows for far too long. Let's take a look at 6-span high. 6-span high, higher boards, right? Looking at the flop strategy once again. Small blind, very rarely going for the donk. They are going to be donking some of these boards. If you look at the small blinds range itself, it's actually very ace-x heavy. And in particular, hands like this ace-8, ace-9, ace-7 are in the small blinds calling range, but aren't in the big blinds 3-bet range, because these hands just call the 3-bet preflop. Sorry, call the open preflop rather than 3-betting themselves. And so as a result, a board like ace-9, ace-8, ace-8, ace-7, ace-7, ace-6, the small blind is actually going to have fairly polar range there, even though their equity is quite low. The remainder of the range, besides the top of it, is basically garbage. And so the small blind actually wants to bet into the big blind. And here we've only got this smaller donking size, 50%, but that probably could increase in size if there was an extra donking size here in the simulation. So you notice that the small blind's range, if you look at this equity graph, the small blind is at the top in blue and the big blind is at the bottom in green. So if you look at the blue graph here, these hands at the top have got a significant amount of equity against the big blind, and those hands are those sort of 2 pairs and sets. And in contrast, like the big blind has a bunch of middling hands. These middling hands are these pocket pairs and sort of the weaker aces, compared to the small blind, which just has a bunch of junk in that middle component of the range. And then obviously the bottom is just trash. It's not really going to do anything. So let's close that off now. That means that the small blind is going to basically check and give up a lot of that trash. But in order to get the big blind to bet into the small blind actually needs to weaken the checking range even further. The small blind can do that by donking out themselves. They're going to be leading with some of the strong hand sets, 2 pairs, etc. Not really going to be facing any raises. If the small blind goes for the check back, the big blind is going to be betting very small. Should be quite cautious. The small blind is going to overfold on this particular board. So this is a 25% pot bet. So alpha is 20%, but here we're folding at 37.6%. So massively overfolding, just because the small blind's defending range is actually losing to many of the bluffs. So if you look at the potential bluff candidates out of the big blind here, a lot of those are going to be king highs and like weak pairs, right? So an 8 here is a bluff. There's not a lot of hands weaker than an 8. So that being said, quarter pot bet, a small blind's kind of going to snap forward a lot of these weak pocket pairs without any kind of additional draw. And obviously many of the king highs are weaker. So those hands just auto fold. But the small blind goes for a very high frequency check raise. Lots of 2 pairs in the range, a fair amount of top pairs. So this sort of 5%, 6%, 2 pair and sets in the checking range, as well as some of the top pairs, goes for this raise, along with some draws as the bluffs and semi-bluffs. And now the big blind can just rip it in with top pair, and here top pair's only got, ace king has only got 55%. That's just denying equity from draws. You're going to get called by some of the top pairs. You're going to get called by basically every flush draw, but obviously you're also going to run into sets and two pairs some of the time as well. So lots of options for the small blind to check raise on these particular boards, but the small blind will also just check and then lose a lot of the time when they've got a weak hand. So very polar board for the small blind. In general, it's going to be pretty good in terms of equity and EV for the big blind, but just the big blind needs to play fairly cautiously on these types of boards. So that's the ace-9-8, ace-8-7 is similar, ace-7-6, ace-10-9, all fairly similar. Ace-10-9 a little bit less so because that 10, the 10 does hit the small blind, but doesn't hit it quite as hard in terms of the two pair density. I mean, sure, there's ace-10 suited, ace-10 offsuit, and the 10-9, but it doesn't hit quite as hard because there's no middle set for the small blind, but there is middle set for the big blind, so not quite as good there. And in addition, the 10 and 9 ends up basically bringing every draw possible. So these like king, queen, offsuit, king, jack suited, these are all draws now. So check and then a small bet would basically mean the small blind still overfolds slightly, but has more resources to defend in terms of these gut shots that can call, rather than any other situation like those king highs, which is junk. All right. And if we contrast that to the king X boards, that ace X board brings a lot of two pairs. This king X board, even though it's the same type, so for example, king 8-7, there's still 8-7, the flush draw, the draws with the suited connectors. But because there's not anywhere near as much the two pair combinations, like this king 7 is not really there, this king 8 is not really there, and there's just fewer king X in general in the small blinds range compared to on the ace X board, at least compared to the big blind, then the small blind, while they still have a relatively polar range on this board, it's not strong enough to want to actually lead out. Now, so if the small blind goes for a check, the big blind is going to size up a little bit to this 1/3 pot. If you notice that the small blind here has plenty of those two pair combinations in terms of the king 8, the king 7, both the offsuit and suited combinations, the offsuit fairly frequently. And so that provides additional coverage on these sorts of boards so that the small blind doesn't get too much of a polarity advantage. It gives the big blind the ability to hit these two pairs with the king 8 and king 7 on a board like this. So let's have a look at another board type. So let's have a look at the paired low flops. So here, if we filter it by EV from the small blind, the small blind is going to be doing better on the queen X board, jack X board, 10X board. That's because the small blind has a fair amount of suited broadways and offsuit broadways, which will hit the queen, the jack, and the 10. And in contrast, the big blind has more like ace X and king X. And so on the ace X and the king X type boards, it's going to slightly favor the big blind. In terms of EV, however, the sort of middling to low pocket pairs on the board, so the middling to low pairs on the board, are going to be better for the small blind in the fact that the small blind can hit a fair amount of trips. The big blind doesn't quite have as many trips. And in contrast, these like 2-2, 3-3 type boards just going to be missing for both players, but the big blind will have some trips with a 2, some trips with a 3, very rarely, but it just totally misses for the small blind, doesn't really improve anything that they've got. And so the polarity of the big blind's preflop range will essentially just win out over the small blind there. So let's take a look at that with the 5-2 specifically. So the small blind here, not doing so well, 48% equity, the EV is 42.71. What's going on is that the small blind checks and now the big blind just bets basically their entire range for a half pot bet. Obviously, the small blind can have difficulty. So obviously, the small blind has a fair amount of difficulty defending against this bet. So here, a half pot bet, folding 38% of the time. Basically, all these like broadways are not really loving the spot. They haven't really made a hand, but you really do need to float some of these like king X suited, queen X suited out of position. When you do make your pair, the hand actually is fairly strong. But yeah, it's difficult to defend any of this. Like the top of the range basically is this pocket nines. Obviously, you do have some like pocket fives, a little bit of quads, but that sort of makes up like 2% of the range. If you have a hand like 6s, 7s, 8, there's so much equity in the bluffs that you actually need to defend by raising. And so 10s and 9s is going to rip it into you, and you're going to snap it off with 6s, 7s, 8s, and 9s yourself with significantly less than 50% equity with like 6s and 7s, and then nearly a coin flip with pocket 9s. So you just need to get the money in on the flop when your opponent has this much equity against you and your hand is like near the top of your range. It's just the situation that you're in. And then if you do end up calling, all right, you're going to have a bunch of ace highs and king highs. If you make your ace, like both players are going to have a lot of top pair now, but the big blind will just have some stronger top pair with ace king and ace queen. So here the density of the top pair in the big blind's range is actually less than the small blind, 20% compared to 32%. But because the top pairs are stronger, the small blind will just want to check, and then the big blind will just like pot it into you, and then top pair will be calling down. If you make, say, for example, a 10, like the other pairs just keep betting, the strong top pairs just keep betting, 3/4 pot, and then say, for example, 7, check, top pairs, plus just rip it into you, just because you don't really have anything starting from the flop. Like the flop, you just don't really have anything. The board is just so bad. Compare that to a board that's slightly better for the small blind here, than these paired load boards that's slightly better. The small blind here on this 886 has the flush draw. It has some more sets with this 8x, right? It's got some of these 8x suited, 8-7, ace-8, king-8 suited at some frequency. The set of 6s, a little bit of 7-6, 6-5. So it's got some like pairs, it's got some trips. It has some gut shots, plenty of flush draws they can use. So the small blind has more defensive resources here than on the previous board. And once again, because the small blind has more to defend with, the big blind will want to be betting slightly smaller. So here, 1/3 pot, still betting basically the entire range. The small blind will be folding a lot of that junk and then going for an aggressive raise. So if you have a hand like pocket 9s, there's a little bit more benefit in terms of denying some equity. But because there's a flush draw on the board and flush draws are so strong, you actually don't want to get all the money in too early with that particular hand. Of course, if you do get jammed on, you're going to be calling it off with pocket 9s and only really have 36% equity. Pocket 7s will have a little bit less than 36%. Yeah, around 36. Sorry, 38 for pocket 9s, 36 for pocket 7s. And obviously the trips will snap it off. All right. And let's have a look at one last texture. Let's have a look at connected mid. So if we look at connected mid for the small blind here, in terms of overall equity, the small blind is doing much better on the high to mid connected mids. All right, particularly some of these 9/8s, basically anything that will complete some straights towards the lower end of the Broadway will do pretty well for the small blind. In contrast, at the higher end of the Broadway, so here like Queen Jack 10 that completes the Ace King, Jack 10 7 that completes the 9/8, but the small blind doesn't really have too much 9/8 because all that 4 bets pre-flop or folds to the 3 bet. Let's double check that. Yeah, a good chunk of it 4 bets pre-flop or folds to the, yeah, it doesn't really fold to 3 bet, but 4 bets pre-flop. So it has less density in terms of 9/8. Wrong board. This one. So let's take a look at some of that. Because these boards are actually pretty good for the small blind will actually start to donk some of them. So here, for example, unlike a Jack 10-9, the King Queen for both players is suddenly a man of straight. And the small blind actually has a lot of King Queen. The small blind calls a significant amount of the King Queen offsuit pre-flop. And so you're just going to have a lot of straights here, 10.7% straights. So the small blind should be leading out. If the small blind checks, the big blind can go for like a smallish bet. And then the small blind is going to defend pretty well. So 3rd pot bet, folding 30% of the time, alpha is 25%. So it's not doing too bad. The big blind has significantly fewer straights in terms of overall density than the small blind. The big blind will 3-bet a lot of the King Queen and basically all the King Queen suited, but because there's more hands in the big blind's 3-bet range, more total combos, the relative density of the straight is decreased. And if you notice this difference of 10.7% compared to this 5.2%, the small blind has twice as many straights than the big blind. And some of these straights for the big blind are going to be the bottom end, the Queen 8 and the 8-7. There is going to be a little bit of that 8-7 and the Queen 8 for the small blind as well. But we're mainly focusing on the King Queen here. And there's just going to be basically twice as much density of king queen in the small blind's range. So the small blind needs to lead out with those hands in order to weaken the checking range. If the checking range is too strong, the small blind just won't bet. Sorry, the big blind just won't bet into the small blind too often, and then you don't get your value when you have your nuts. All right. And if we compare that to the other end of it in terms of EV, like it's Jack 10-7. Jack 10-7, really only 9-8 is the only straight. So if you notice back on these boards, the connected boards that have a higher connectivity in terms of more possible straights are just going to be better for the small blind compared to the big blind. And then the lower connectivity is just going to be better for the big blind. So when there's fewer possible straights, you end up leading towards the big blind in terms of EV. Anyway, Jack 10-7 is only the 9-8. So what's really going on here is that there's a lot of draws around the Jack and the 10. The 9-8 is already made. There's more 9-8 for the big blind in terms of percentage. There's very little in terms of percentage for the small blind listed in this simulation. There's still a set of 7s. All right, this is some 2-pair with the Jack 10. That's really about it. The big blind has all the straights with the 9-8, all the sets, Jacks, 10s, 7s, over pairs, good top pairs. Small blind is pretty capped, so 3/4 pot bet, nice and big and chunky on a board this wet. The big blind can make it pretty big. Small blind, knowing that the big blind's bluffing hands just have a significant amount of equity. So we're talking about hands like king, queen, ace, king, ace, queen, like 2 other cards with a gut shot, potentially backdoor flush draws, other kind of open enders like the queen 9, king, queen is just an open ender, other sorts of gut shots. Basically, any 8, any 9 is already a gut shot. So there's loads of possible combos that you could use. Just random overcards, backdoor flush draws like this ace 3, ace 4 going to be thrown in there. So big bet size. A hand like Jack 10, the 2-pair, doesn't really like this spot. There's so many draws, just rips it in now. 2 times a pot. King queen is a major semi bluff there. Jack 9, top pair, very vulnerable to the overcards, making stronger top pairs. It's a top pair with a gut shot as well, so it's got a fair amount of equity, but is very vulnerable, so that can be thrown in as the all-in. A little 10-9, similar sorts of reasons, thrown in as a rip it on the flop. And then, of course, overpaired type hands, snapping it off, 45% equity, top pairs down to this Jack 8 with 40-ish% equity. Once again, loads of draws need to be made into the jamming range, so all this king queen being thrown in there, these sort of Jack 9 type hands, 10-9 at lowish frequency in order to actually get your opponent to call this wide when you've got the Jack 10 yourself. If it just bricks out, check. Big blind just keeps hammering on the turn with overpairs, good top pairs. These weaker 2 pairs of 10-7 unblocking the top pair. Bet, you're going to get jammed on once again. There's only like 40% of the pot left here, and the draws will have a good amount of equity. Check, jam for the remaining 40%, top pair plus. Fairly aggressive play out of big blind there, in contrast to the other board types, which is better for the small blind. The small blind leads out and the big blind plays quite passively. All right, so we looked at the pre-flop ranges for both players with the small blind and the big blind. And then we looked at a variety of flop textures. And the main thing that we focused on is the differences between the flop textures and which particular flops are better for the small blind and better for the big blind, and how both players should approach those flops. So I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye now.